Ersin Demir, we had him earlier, and we started the conversation asking about Jaedon LeDee and this basic premise of why are people sleeping on Jaedon LeDee? Does it have to do with his age or not? Take a listen.
Well, to me, the two things are important. I think with the cap rules changing for the NBA teams, what they are trying to do is bring in cheap contracts, experience on cheap contracts. So that's why you see most guys having Jaedon LeDee in their second round or going undrafted. So he has a choice to where he can eventually sign. But I believe in Jaedon LeDee as a second round pick early in the second round because of all the offensive versatility that he brings to the floor. I think with him, it's the size is not really the size advantage, but the strength advantage, and him leveraging his strength very well at the collegiate level to make advantages for himself and others. I think what I like about his role is more as a connective piece, as a four. I think he's a good passer out of the entry passes and a bit out of the short roll in the future. And mostly what I like about his game, making it NBA compatible, is his finishing at the rim as a play finisher. I think he can expand his offensive role by act more playing as an active cutter and getting other ways to score. I don't think he has to necessarily be a shooter to survive in the NBA, although how weird that sounds, because the biggest value I see in his NBA role is most teams are hard hedging or blitzing ball enders. So you need that short ball playmaker to make up for it, to not one commit too much turnovers and two to keep that offensive rating at par. And that's where I see value for Jaedon LeDee. I think as a short ball playmaker, that's where he will eventually get better in the NBA. I think he can bail out, especially undersized ball enders, by having a guy in the middle who can continue to make plays. And I think his role at San Diego State was eventually to be the leading scorer this season, right? I think last season was the first time that I personally saw him play in the tournament. And I immediately was like, wow, this guy is going to be a pro. But I was struggling with the role he's going to play because I initially thought that he has a great entry point to go to Europe at a certain point in his career if the NBA doesn't work. But right now, I think he can play for the NBA, especially for playoff teams. If he's going to the NBA, he has to go to a winning team. It wouldn't make sense for him to go to a team that's trying to make the playoffs because you have to give him a certain role and expect him to thrive on it. And looking back at the cap situation of most teams, they're trying to figure out how to get in cheap contracts, offense on cheap contracts and offensive value on cheap contracts. And that's why I like Jaedon LeDee so much. And as an All-American, they're showing it all. He has shown it in an expanded role this season at San Diego State. And to me, he put his name on the circuit in last year's tournament in San Diego State's final run. So to make a long story short, I think it's more fit and specific role as a 4 and not really as a 5 because he can maintain especially his profile as a non-shooter, how I really see him, with his rebounding. I think it is impact, if you count the amount of possessions in a game as a rebounder, he's going to play hard on the defensive and the offensive end, in terms of hitting the offensive glass, of playing hard on the defensive box outs. And I think another trend in the NBA is that you see most teams are struggling with their defense rebound rate off the bench. So he's one of those perfect glue guys, I think that's a role that he will thrive on. And to me, that's a good value in the second round.
It doesn't feel like there's a consensus top number 1 overall pick this year, but who are some names that could go number 1 overall this year in your mind?
Well, to me, I think in the Atlanta Hawks are in an interesting situation because they have to keep Trae Young happy. I think facilitating Trae Young with the number 1 pick is the way to go. So I'm leaning towards a big man. I think Donovan Clingan is my favorite to go number 1. I think he's among the big men that's drafted in race the best option. But Alexander Sarr is the consensus number 1 because of the defensive potential that he is showing and more in terms of a long-term bet. But I think the Hawks are more so in a situation where they have to keep Trae happy and be going back to the playoffs again. And their defensive rating has been very bad for a couple of years. They went to the Eastern Conference Finals and the defense has been bad for 3 years straight. So that's something that they have to fix. So Clingan is definitely the favorite on that end, in my opinion. I think Risa Shaby going to the number 1 wouldn't really move the needle for me because the Hawks doesn't really need another wing. So that takes away some of the fit value. But in terms of talent, I think there are multiple ways to go. I think even potential guys like, I'm not personally that high on Reed Shepard, for example, but you can make the case as him as potential number 1 value with how spread out this class is in terms of the top, because there's no consensus number 1 guy. And to me, that makes in this class so much fun.
Ersin Demir with us right now, John and Jim, San Diego Sports 760, NBA draft analyst. Of course, the NBA draft coming up later this week. Another Aztec for life, although he spent his last year at Arizona. is Keshad Johnson, who spent 4 years at San Diego State, started on that national championship team, had maybe even more of an offensive role last year at the University of Arizona. How do you see his skill set translating, and how does he compare? He's a different player than Jaedon LeDee, but what do his prospects look like compared to Jaedon LeDee in the NBA?
Well, with Jaedon LeDee, you're buying primarily offense, and with Keshad Johnson, I think it's the other way around. That you're primarily buying defense. I think he's one of the best pick and roll defenders in college basketball. That's something that he continued to do at Arizona. I think with his size, his athleticism, that's what you need, especially with the league's trend of experimenting with inverted pick and rolls, for example. That's a great option to eventually respond to that as a defender because he has the physicality to match it with the big bodies. I think that's a way that the NBA is trying to go to, experiment more with that. And I think overall as a defender, of course, he shows leadership, and especially on the star-studded Arizona team with a lot of seniors. I think as a leader, as more of that, as a freak athlete by nature and as a good interior defender, he's going to get an NBA job. But the thing with Keshad Johnson, which will make the offensive translation much more tougher compared to LeDee, is I think he is mostly forcing the offense at times. And Arizona was mostly a three-point shooting team, with him being one of the not a good three-point shooter by any means compared to the other guys that they had. So that basically made it tougher for him, and how teams are scheming against him and playing with a two big man lineup, especially if you count Keshad Johnson as a college big. It makes it tougher for teams as well because it was mostly scheme-wise. But in the NBA, I think he will play mostly as a four, not primarily as a player as a smaller five, because I think in the NBA a smaller five has to be able to shoot. I think he's a good ball mover. He's not so say a good playmaker by any means, but he shouldn't have to, because I think in the defensive end he has enough tools to keep his name on the court. But the challenge for him is, and I have him going undrafted as one of the early undrafted free agents going to likely sign a two-way contract, is I think the offense is still behind in terms of what an NBA team is going to ask from him, because I think as a play finisher is not really enough. And with Jaedon LeDee, he has a lot his rebounding, his passing game to leverage on the offensive end, and his strength advantage to maintain an offensive rating. But with Keshad Johnson, it's a bit tougher because he will eventually have to shoot, or he has to be a very good play finisher with his cutting, which is not very likely because the NBA is not focusing on having low usage guys play mostly as cutters and serving them. So eventually to improve as a shooter is imminent for them. And he has some good numbers at Arizona, but the team context is Arizona was a good three-point shooting team, and they had to do that because teams were scheming away the big man down low, so it opened up the rest for them. I think in terms of total value, Keshad Johnson will be one of the, I think, safer bets, especially with most players wanting to choose their own destination in undrafted free agency. I think Keshad Johnson is young for a senior. I think he will turn 23, either right after draft or just before. I'm not really sure about that, but I know he's a young senior for the fifth year guy, and he's bringing all this experience. He's a San Diego State legend. And he went to Arizona. He has shown similar things, but at a new team, at a competing team. So it's good. I think it's a good feasibility test for NBA teams to see that he can play in a certain role in the NBA. And then you have to, just like LeDee it is in the NBA, you have to scale down the role, because I think college basketball is not really reflecting what an NBA team should use these players. And mostly is in the modern four type of mold where they both players fit. I think that's where most teams need help. So it immediately creates value for them alongside their experience, of course.
What makes Brony James attractive to NBA teams besides the fact that he's LeBron James' son at this point in time? And do you see him as an NBA player ready right now?
I don't think he's an NBA ready player right now, but I think the teams, for example, if he changed the name for not being LeBron James' son, he would be a fringe NBA prospect, in my opinion, because in his role, I think at his size, being undersized, is you have to really be a good playmaker to make up for it, or really be a good have outlier skills on the defensive end. And we see many undersized guards in the NBA finding max contracts. For example, John Moran, Darius Garland, Jalen Brunson is a very good player. They're all undersized players, but the size is not really the issue with Brony James. Is more so his style of play. I think he is very how do you call it? I think he's modest. I think at USC, with the injuries that they had, he had to eventually take over, and he didn't do that. He had a few games where he should have 10 or 12 shot attempts, but he didn't do that. It wasn't really his game. I think he allowed others to really thrive instead and take their roles. For example, Collier or Kobe Johnson. And the context for him is, I think USC was not a good three-point shooting team, and he has to be a good three-point shooter to survive in the NBA. And he's more so one of those connective guards with NBA teams that are built to the wings, with the most usage going to the wings. You have to have a guard who is going to make good decisions on the defensive end, keep the ball moving, and how to orchestrate an offense in terms of putting context to structure to it. For example, the Phoenix Suns are being named as one of the favorite destinations for Bronny because they need a guy like him. I think they need a guy like him with a great basketball IQ. That's what he has from his father. And with terms of the reads that he's making on defensive end, you can see that he comes from a pro in terms of the family ties. But other than that, he doesn't really have an outlier skill as an undersized guard, which is making it harder for me to project a certain role for him in the NBA or to put him, for example, in the first round, the second round. I think the draft buzz is basically all over the place. And of course, being LeBron James' son is definitely a part of the value that he has. So that's making it tough and unfair to him, unfortunately. But I think that's how the NBA works as well, right? Because it's all about value at the end of the day.
Ersin Demir, great insight for our listeners, for San Diego State Aztecs fans. Looking forward to this week with both Jaedon LeDee and Keshad Johnson likely finding destinations at some point, whether they're drafted or as undrafted free agents. Ersin, before you go, where can our listeners find more information in terms of your mock drafts and more?
Well, I write for my Substack, so that's edemimba.substack.com, and I have over 80 plus scouting reports on my Substack available for everyone. One on Keshad Johnson, unfortunately not one on Jaedon LeDee, but I focus on the less covered NBA prospects. That's my style of writing, because I don't really care about the top guys, mostly about finding value, and I think this class was a good example of finding value. So I try to emphasize that with my newsletter, which is still growing. And I tweet about basketball nonstop on Twitter. It's the same EDMIR NBA. And I want to give next year San Diego State a big shout out. I think BJ Davis is not really being covered as an NBA prospect. I think he will be one if he will get the opportunity to play. To me, it's very early to see what's going to happen at San Diego State. But I think BJ Davis will be a guy that we'll see much more in the national media next season.
Exciting stuff for Aztec fans. Yeah, great stuff. Ersin, we appreciate you hopping on here in San Diego.
Thank you, gentlemen, for having me.
All right. So again, this was an NBA draft analyst that joined us earlier in the day because he's in the Netherlands. I had seen on social media within the week that he had posted something about BJ Davis, and some Aztec fans were talking about it. But a guy that rarely played a year ago, coveted prospect out of high school, Aztecs at veteran guards a year ago, but he likes BJ Davis's potential. We haven't yet even seen it on the Mesa, but I think if you're a San Diego State fan, you're probably excited when you hear something like that about what BJ Davis could mean for the Aztecs as soon as this year.
If what he said about LeDee and Keshad and BJ Davis come true, like, bro, Aztecs fans need to follow Ersin Demir's right now.
Right.
Because dude's got like an eye for the I guess, what do you say? He covers the
like less
diamonds in the rough.
Yeah, not like the first 5 picks. Like he's looking at guys like in the 20s, 30s, 40s.
Yeah,
they're going to get selected.
Yeah, BJ Davis is a guy. He's probably going to get opportunities this year, and potentially more next season if he's here. And so we'll just have to see his growth. But that's pretty cool to hear about. BJ Davis. Like, hey, watch for this kid.
Absolutely. Now, the thing with the draft tomorrow is that this isn't last year with this can't miss Victor Wembanyama. Like the top of this draft is bizarre. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of players from overseas that could go 1 and 2. You have like Donovan Clingan. Aztec fans know about him from the last 2 years, but he's not some like elite scorer. He's an amazing shot blocker. He's been a good scorer. Right? Like Reed Shepherd, Kentucky. Like these aren't household, can't miss, surefire Hall of Fame guys, seemingly at the top of this class. So it'll be interesting to see what happens tomorrow night. And like even pick number 1. I don't think anyone's fully convinced that Atlanta's going to do it number 1.
It feels like this is the role players draft where maybe there isn't a star in this NBA draft, but there's a lot of role players. Role players are good, but when you think about having the first pick in the draft, you think about getting a guy like Zion or Wemby, or maybe that 1 year where you're lucky enough to have the feet on like a LeBron.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not, but like, or like a Blake Griffin. This year, Donovan Clingan,
number 1 overall.
I mean, he's a good player. He's a really good college player, but do you see him coming in the NBA and like immediately like
I don't know.
changing a franchise?
The NBA draft is interesting because some of the biggest stars in the game are obviously international. It's been that way for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
But we don't have the same familiarity with them during the course of the year. Like even Wemby, yeah, he was a big name because he was a big name. Everyone saw his size. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
But like Alex Sarr,
Who?
And the dude that might go number one, I can't even pronounce his name. I have no idea what his name is. And I was listening to something last night, and like, yeah, he's like a 3-and-D guy. I'm like, at number 1 overall,
3-and-D.
like, isn't that like a role? You're gonna choose you're gonna choose a role player,
Yeah,
with the first overall pick.
Yeah, this is the role players draft,
Weird.
John, where
Someone will emerge
Maybe.
after the fact.
maybe,
I would think.
but there will probably be a lot of role players in this draft.
You're probably right.
Which, I mean, if you're Atlanta, you're sitting there being like, "Oh, we got the number 1 pick. Why couldn't we have gotten it last year?"
Right.
Because Wemby's like generational.
I'm convinced of this. If Jaedon doesn't get drafted, it's because of his age.
And you're gonna riot.
No, I still think he ends up in a good spot as an undrafted free agent. You could argue maybe it's better because you have your pick of the litter. But if he's not drafted, based on everything we saw from him, it's because of his age, which I don't think is fully right, because who cares about 6 years from now? Like, don't you want someone that can help you immediately? Like, are you thinking about 6 years from now if you're taking someone in the second round of the NBA draft? I wouldn't be.
And the thing about the NBA, and really all sports, mostly just football and NBA, because baseball, it's like, but the fit matters the most. Especially, I mean, NBA and NFL especially. But if you go to a spot or you go to an organization that isn't a good organization, has constant turnover, and you're just going to basically go and be lost forever and go into NBA purgatory, that's where you don't want Jaedon to go.
I agree with that. Yeah, he's got to be somewhere, and I think he mentioned this in the conversation. He's got to be somewhere where we can contribute immediately for a good team. Like he's ready to go. So let's see if he gets to the right spot here this summer. On the